Putin's victory parade speech just exposed the exit strategy he hoped nobody would notice. A net loss of 116 square kilometers in a single month. 3 days later, Putin gave a speech about peace. Here is what that sequence actually means, and why the parade that came before the speech may be the most important part of the story nobody is telling you. By the end of this, you will understand the specific domestic survival operation that Putin is now running, and the narrow window he has left to pull it off. Quick question before we go further. If you were Putin right now, which would frighten you more? Losing ground in Ukraine, or losing the Russians who used to cheer for you? Hold that thought. The answer shapes everything. The May 9th parade was not a celebration. It was a damage assessment dressed in military uniforms. Since 2000, Putin has used the Red Square parade to project Russian strength, designed as much for domestic consumption as for foreign intimidation. Intercontinental missiles, armored columns, fighter jet formations, a visual argument that Russia is unbeatable, and your leader controls all of it. That argument requires spectacle. What Red Square saw on May 9th, 2026 was neither. The armored column was reduced. The aerial display was stripped back. State media framed the absence as intentional restraint, but restraint has never featured in Putin's Victory Day vocabulary. For a Russian watching at home, the gap between 2022 and 2026 is not subtle. It generates questions in a country where questions are dangerous. A shrinking parade is a confession no speech walks back. That is the context in which every word Putin said afterward must be read, not as the declaration of a confident leader, but as the managed communication of someone whose most powerful annual symbol just failed to perform its one job. Start there, and everything he said afterward reads completely differently. In 2025, Xi Jinping stood on the reviewing platform at Red Square. In 2026, the best confirmed attendance Putin could produce was Alexander Lukashenko, his own client, alongside representatives from Laos, Kazakhstan, and South Ossetia, a territory Russia itself recognizes as independent and almost nobody else does. Set those two guest lists side by side, and the collapse in Russian geopolitical standing becomes impossible to spin. Xi's presence in 2025 sent a message to every Western government: China is not walking away from Russia. His absence in 2026 sent the opposite message with equal clarity. Beijing has been carefully managing its distance from Moscow since late 2025, as Chinese exporters faced secondary sanction pressure from the United States and the EU. Xi's calculation is unsentimental. Russia is a useful partner until it becomes a liability, and the 2026 parade told Beijing exactly which category Russia now occupies. Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's leader and another fixture of Putin's shrinking circle of allies, is no longer a factor following a U.S. enforcement action. The pattern is not coincidental. Putin's allies are not leaving, they are being removed or retreating. Each empty seat on that reviewing platform represents a card Putin believed he held that has since turned blank. And the cumulative effect of those empty seats, visible to every Russian watching the broadcast, is that the world is not standing with Russia the way that 4 years of state media insisted it would. Putin walked off that stage knowing that the parade had already told a story he would now have to spend his entire speech trying to contradict.
Picture a military commander who has spent 4 years telling his country that the enemy is collapsing. Then April's numbers arrive on his desk. According to analysis published by the Institute for the Study of War in early May 2026, Russia recorded a net territorial loss of 116 square kilometers in April alone, the first month of net Russian losses since August 2024. The Donetsk offensive, which Putin had positioned as the inevitable culmination of the special military operation, has stalled. Meanwhile, Ukraine's push in the south has not only held, but accelerated, with Ukrainian forces reclaiming over 400 square kilometers in that corridor since late 2025. Russia's monthly casualty rate is running at approximately 35,000 soldiers, according to Ukrainian general staff figures cited across multiple Western defense monitors in April 2026. At that rate, Russia has now absorbed over 1.3 million total casualties since February 2022. The consequence for an ordinary Russian is not abstract.
Those 35,000 monthly casualties are fathers, sons, and brothers who left for the front and did not come back, and their families know exactly why. You cannot hide 35,000 empty chairs every single month. The gap between what state media promises and what Russian households are actually experiencing is now wide enough that no amount of broadcast management fully closes it. Understand those numbers first. Then Putin's sudden interest in peace talks stops looking like confidence and starts looking like arithmetic.
Putin did not say the word war once in his post-parade speech. He never does. But the specific word he chose this time is worth examining closely. I think that the matter is coming to an end. That sentence, delivered on May 9, 2026, contains a deliberate linguistic construction that Russian political analysts have tracked since 2022. Delo, the Russian word rendered here as matter, is a bureaucratic and legal term. It carries connotations of a case being processed, a file being closed, an administrative procedure reaching its conclusion. It is the language of resolution, not the language of triumph. Compare it to the vocabulary Putin used in February 2022, when state television broadcast maps of Ukraine with timelines measured in days, and anchors used phrases like liberation and reunification. The distance between that vocabulary and the matter is coming to an end is not semantic drift. It is a managed retreat across 4 years of failed promises, expressed one careful word at a time. For a viewer inside Russia, that shift in language is the first signal that the story they were sold is being quietly revised. When a leader drops the word victory, he is already conceded. The revision is not announced, it is embedded in word choices, in tone, in what is no longer said, because Putin cannot afford to admit the shift directly without triggering the exact domestic crisis he is trying to prevent. The word matter is doing enormous political work, and Putin chose it on purpose.
How much does an approval rating drop matter in a country where people are afraid to say they disapprove? VTSIOM, the state-run polling agency that conducts surveys on behalf of the Kremlin, reported in late April 2026 that Putin's approval rating had fallen from 74% in February to 65.5%, a drop of 8.5 percentage points in roughly 10 weeks. On its face, 65.5% still looks like a comfortable majority, but that reading requires understanding the environment in which Russian polling operates. Respondents answering a state-administered survey in a country where public dissent carries criminal penalties are not expressing honest preferences. They are making a calculated risk assessment about what is safe to say out loud. Political scientists who study authoritarian polling, including Levada Center researchers writing in early 2025, have consistently noted that declared support in Russian state polls functions as a floor, not a ceiling. The real sentiment is measurably lower. An 8.5-point drop in that environment over 10 weeks is not a polling fluctuation. It is a visible fracture. The consequence for Putin is direct and personal. His entire domestic political architecture rests on the perception of overwhelming popular support. The moment that perception cracks, even inside the carefully managed space of a state poll, it creates permission for other cracks to follow. In a fear state, a falling number is a signal. Other officials read it. Military commanders read it. The oligarchs who have stayed quiet for 4 years read it. And they all begin recalculating. Putin read those numbers before he wrote that speech. Every word he chose on May 9th was a direct response to what those numbers told him about how much time he has left.
That fracture in the parade, the territory, the language, and now the numbers is what we are unpacking here. If this analysis is what you come for, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The second half is where the real machinery gets exposed. The propaganda playbook Putin is recycling, and the window he has left before the exit ramp closes. In the winter of 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée retreated from Moscow in ruins, and Russian state storytelling has never stopped using that image. Putin has reached for that story, and others like it, repeatedly across his 25 years in power. In a February 2022 speech that Russian political historian Mark Galeotti analyzed in a piece for the Royal United Services Institute, Putin explicitly invoked Sweden's Charles XII at Poltava in 1709, Napoleon's 1812 campaign, and Hitler's Operation Barbarossa in 1941. 3 separate centuries, 3 separate invaders, one consistent message. Russia is always the nation that absorbs foreign aggression and survives. The victim who endures narrative is not a rhetorical flourish in Russian political culture. It is the load-bearing structure of the entire national identity that Putin has spent 2 decades constructing. Every school curriculum revision, every state media broadcast, every Victory Day parade has reinforced the same spine. Russia does not start wars, it finishes the ones others bring to its doorstep. What Putin is doing now in his post-parade speeches is not a new invention. It is an acceleration of existing architecture. Putin isn't building a new story, he's renovating the old one. The renovation is necessary because the original version, Russia liberates Ukraine in days, has been visibly demolished by 4 years of battlefield reality. So Putin is reaching for the deeper foundation, Russia as eternal victim of Western aggression, with Ukraine recast as merely the latest theater in a centuries-old confrontation. That reframe has one specific domestic purpose. It gives Russian citizens a way to accept an outcome that falls short of victory without calling it a defeat. Imagine you are a Finnish citizen in May 2026. Your country joined NATO in April 2026, the direct consequence of watching Russia invade a neighboring country that had also been told it had nothing to fear. Putin's response to Finnish NATO membership, delivered in public statements on May 10, 2026, one day after the parade, was striking in its construction. He claimed Finland joined NATO not out of fear of Russia, but because Finnish leadership hoped that NATO pressure would cause Russia to collapse economically and territorially, allowing Finland to reclaim land it lost in the 1940 Winter War. He pointed to construction activity along the Sestra River as physical evidence of Finnish territorial ambition. This reframing performs a precise political function. It converts Finland's defensive decision, joining a mutual defense alliance after witnessing a land invasion next door, into an act of predatory opportunism targeting a vulnerable Russia. The logic is circular by design. Russia's neighbors arm themselves because Russia invades neighbors, and Putin presents that arming as proof that Russia is the target. The correction here is important. NATO did not expand toward Russia. Russia's behavior expanded NATO toward itself. Finland shares a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia and had maintained careful neutrality for 80 years before February 2022 made that neutrality impossible to sustain. Russia didn't face NATO expansion. Russia manufactured it. Putin's Finland framing is not a geopolitical analysis. It is a domestic sedative, designed to convince Russians that the isolation closing around them is evidence of Western fear, rather than the consequence of Russian choices. That sedative needs to work fast, because the geopolitical walls are closing in from every direction simultaneously.
4 years ago, Russia entered Ukraine expecting to inherit a continent's fear. What it is inheriting instead is Ukraine's defense contracts. As of May 2026, approximately 20 countries are either finalizing or actively negotiating drone manufacturing agreements with Ukraine, according to reporting by the Odessa Journal and corroborated by European Defense Ministry announcements in April 2026. The European Union finalized a $106 billion loan package to Ukraine following the removal of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban from his blocking position in early 2026, the single largest financial commitment to Ukraine's war effort since 2022. Gulf states affected by regional instability linked to the Iran conflict have begun signing decade-long defense cooperation agreements with Kyiv. Ukraine is not simply surviving Russian pressure. It is converting that pressure into an industrial and diplomatic infrastructure that will outlast the war itself. Meanwhile, Russia's most significant remaining defense partner, North Korea, has supplied artillery shells and infantry units, an arrangement that tells its own story about the quality of allies available to Moscow in 2026. The consequence for Russia's negotiating position is concrete and worsening.
Every drone deal Ukraine signs is a future capability Russia cannot neutralize diplomatically. Every EU loan tranche is a signal to markets and governments that the West has made a generational bet on Ukrainian survival. Ukraine is building an army. Russia is burning one. The asymmetry is not temporary, it is structural, and it compounds every month that the war continues. Putin is watching Ukraine's international footprint expand in real time, and he knows that every week of delay makes his eventual negotiating position weaker, not stronger.
Here are two numbers that, placed side by side, make Russia's continuation of this war mathematically indefensible. First number, 35,000. That is Russia's approximate monthly battlefield casualty figure as of April 2026, per Ukrainian General Staff data, cross-referenced with British Ministry of Defense intelligence updates. At that rate, Russia will have absorbed a further 210,000 casualties by the end of 2026 alone, on top of the 1.3 million already recorded since February 2022. Second number, 1%. That is the share of Ukrainian territory Russia managed to capture across the entirety of 2025, according to analysis published by the George W. Bush Presidential Center. Combine those two figures, and the arithmetic produces a single conclusion. At current rates, Russia would require approximately 80 more years to capture the remaining Ukrainian territory that Putin's original operation was meant to secure in days. The research on Russia's economic capacity to sustain this trajectory is not mixed. The IMF's April 2026 Article 4 consultation on Russia flagged accelerating inflation, a defense spending share of GDP approaching 9%, and structural labor shortages driven directly by frontline mobilization pulling working-age men out of the domestic economy. For the Russian citizen, this translates into rising prices, shrinking wages in real terms, and a cost of living pressure that state media cannot fully attribute to Western sanctions forever. 80 years to victory. That is the plan. Putin cannot say that out loud, but his generals can do the same arithmetic he can, and so can the business leaders he summoned in mid-April 2026 and demanded solutions from. Solutions that do not exist while the war continues. That is the dual reality closing around Putin from both ends simultaneously. An army bleeding out at the front and an economy hollowing out at home.
Putin has a window. It is not large, and it is closing from both ends at once. The summer of 2026 represents the last viable moment for Russia to enter peace negotiations from a position that can be domestically packaged as anything other than outright defeat. Here is why that window is specific. Russia's spring offensive was meant to produce meaningful Donetsk gains before the summer mud season slows large-scale armored movement. It has not. By September 2026, when the next major operational period opens, Ukraine will have absorbed another full cycle of EU funding, additional drone manufacturing capacity from its new partner agreements, and further Western military aid flowing under the framework signed in early 2026. Each of those inputs compounds Ukraine's battlefield advantage. Russia, by contrast, enters that same September window with a further 6 months of casualties at 35,000 per month, a defense budget that the IMF has already flagged as structurally unsustainable beyond 2027, and a domestic approval trajectory that has moved in only one direction since February 2026. The trend line does not require extrapolation. It requires only arithmetic. Putin knows that negotiating in the summer of 2026 produces a better outcome for Russia than negotiating in the winter of 2027, and a vastly better outcome than being forced to negotiate by domestic collapse rather than by choice. The exit ramp exists now. It will not exist indefinitely. That is the forward calculation embedded in every carefully chosen word Putin has delivered since May 9th. The speech was not about Ukraine. It was about buying enough time to use that ramp before it disappears.
What Putin's post-parade words actually reveal is a leader who has run the numbers, read the polls, watched his allies disappear from the reviewing stand, and concluded that the story he sold in February 2022 cannot be delivered. The new story, Russia as NATO's victim, withdrawing to protect itself rather than retreating in defeat, is now being assembled in real time,
targeted at a domestic audience that is already asking questions he cannot afford to answer honestly. The window to exit on his own terms is the summer of 2026. After that, the terms will be set by momentum he no longer controls. For what happens inside Russia if that window closes without a deal, including what a senior Communist Party figure said on the floor of the State Duma about the conditions for a 1917 scale rupture, that breakdown is in our next video.